I woke up that Saturday with a strange feeling. Something wasn't right, but, still a little drowsy, I attributed it to too much beer the night before. I got up, drank a coffee bitter enough to wake a dead man, and headed to the marina where my yacht was moored. The plan was simple. Take the boat out, go for a relaxing ride, and forget for a few hours that I was working surrounded by incompetent bureaucrats. But when I got there, well, let's just say it was the beginning of the worst headache of my life. My yacht wasn't in place. For a second, I considered the possibility that I was going mad. I looked around, checked the coordinates of the spot, even checked the messages on my cell phone to make sure I hadn't lent the boat to some drunk friend. But no, the yacht had simply disappeared. It was only when I started questioning the marina staff that the truth began to emerge, slow and sticky like a clogged drain. One of the employees, visibly uncomfortable, told me that the association lady had ordered my yacht to be towed away because it was outside the aesthetic standards of the community. Lady of the association. It hit me so fast that I could almost hear the noise inside my head. I knew exactly who was responsible for this idiocy. The woman who turned every condominium meeting into a spectacle worthy of a court-martial. The same woman who picked on the height of the grass, the colors of the houses, and the sound of other people's laughter. Gritting my teeth, I walked to the HOA office. If there was one place in the world where joy went to die, it was there. A dull building with soulless beige walls and a receptionist with the expression of someone who had already given up on life. My boat was removed without authorization. "I want to know where it is," I said, trying to keep my tone civil. The receptionist didn't even blink, just pointed to a door at the end of the corridor. And so it was that seconds later, I was face to face with the creature responsible for my growing desire to commit a crime. The woman who thought she owned that condominium. She was sitting behind a desk full of useless papers, as if she were the CEO of a large company, and not just the local queen of hell. When she saw me, she smiled in that condescending way that made me want to bang my head against the wall. "Ah, you've finally turned up. We've been waiting." Were we? Who's we? Her and the other tyrants on the estate? I took a deep breath, trying not to explode. "My yacht has disappeared from the marina. Did you have something to do with it?" She didn't seem the least bit concerned. She picked up a piece of paper from the table and read it out loud, as if she were presenting me with courtroom evidence. "All water vehicles must follow the aesthetic regulations established by the association. Any vessel that violates these rules is subject to removal." She then looked at me, satisfied, as if she had just closed the case. "Your boat was problematic," she continued. "Too big, too flashy. It stood out from the rest of the marina." I blinked. "You took my yacht out of the marina because it was flashy?" "That's right. We, as an association, have a standard to maintain. Your boat was out of harmony with the condominium." My fingers itched. Counting to 10 wouldn't be enough. I'd have to count to 1,000,000. And where the hell is my boat now? "It's been relocated to a more appropriate place," she said, waving her hand as if she were discarding a crumb from the table. "Relocated? To where?" She tilted her head sideways, as if trying to decide whether it was worth telling me. In the end, she smiled in a way that made me want to throw her paperwork out of the window. "Well, there's a special event happening tonight. A charity party for important members of the community, and we needed a suitable space for it. So, my blood ran cold. You used my yacht for a party?" She laughed, as if I'd just said the most absurd thing in the world. "You see, it was just sitting there, useless. I thought you wouldn't mind." It was at that moment that my patience died. If I were an ordinary person, I might have freaked out, shouted, or called the police. But I'm not an ordinary person. I'm an investigator for the United States Coast Guard. And if there's one thing I know how to do well, it's deal with criminals. If the woman thought she could take possession of my yacht without consequences, she was about to learn the hard way what happens when you mess with the wrong person. Because one thing was certain. That night, her party wasn't going to end as expected. I arrived at the marina before sunset, with my arms crossed and hatred in my eyes, watching the spectacle of pretension and futility taking place on my own boat. That yacht, which had cost me sweat and years of work, was now adorned with golden lights, tacky floral arrangements, and a makeshift catwalk so that millionaire guests could parade onto it as if they were part of a champagne commercial. It was outrageous. I still hadn't decided exactly how I wanted to ruin the evening, but I knew one thing: the boat was mine, and no one would leave without knowing it. I walked along the pier, mingling with the guests who arrived in limousines and hired sports cars. The men wore suits that were too expensive for an event of this level, and the women looked like they'd stepped out of a dress catalog and shouted, "Look at me!" One of them, a guy who reeked of new money and insecurity, looked at me and frowned, clearly noticing that I didn't fit in. "Are you from around here?" he asked, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt, as if it were an obligation to demonstrate his superiority. I shrugged. Something like that. Before he had time to ask any more questions, the sound of a microphone being tested echoed around the pier. I turned towards my own boat, and there she was, standing as if she were the queen of some small empire. Her smile was wide, fake, the kind that only appears when someone wants to impress others. She raised her wine glass as if she were about to give an important speech, and, in that instant, I was sure that this woman had never heard a no in her life. "Good evening, dear members of our lovely community," she began, her voice affected and rehearsed. "Today, we are celebrating another special event promoted by our beloved association." I wanted to see how far this clowning would go. I crossed my arms, watching as she continued her speech full of empty words about tradition, exclusivity, and preserving the values of the condominium. It was like watching a cheap play. The guests clapped politely, some clearly more interested in the waiters serving drinks than in the hostess's speech. Then the speech took a turn that killed my patience. And, of course, we couldn't have chosen a better place for this memorable evening. Thanks to the commitment of our association, we were able to get this beautiful yacht to serve as a stage for our charitable cause. My yacht, my yacht. I knew she was abused. But that was another level. Not only had she confiscated my property, but now she was selling the idea that it was an achievement of the Bloody Residents Association. I bit the inside of my cheek to hold back the urge to laugh, but not a laugh of amusement. A laugh from someone who knows they're about to turn that night into someone's private hell. Instead of making a fuss, I discreetly climbed aboard. The yacht was different. Rugs had been laid out to cover the floor, a few tables had been positioned on the main deck, and waiters walked among the guests holding trays of canapés and glasses of champagne. I walked straight past all the people and up to the cockpit. There it was, my control panel intact, the keys exactly where they should be. They may have redecorated the boat, but no one thought to turn it off completely or change the cabin security. Dumb. I sat down in the chair, turned on the microphone on the sound system, and, without any ceremony, announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I hope you're enjoying the party, but I need to make a small announcement before you continue. This yacht, on which you are so comfortably ensconced, does not belong to the Residents' Association." Silence fell over the deck. Down below, I saw the hostess freeze. Her smile vanished instantly, replaced by an expression of incredulity and restrained fury. "He belongs to me," I continued, feeling the sweet taste of revenge taking shape. "And, for your information, I'm an investigator for the United States Coast Guard, which means that, technically, you're all taking part in an event promoted by trespassers on someone else's property." The murmurs began. One of the guests dropped his glass of champagne so quickly that the waiter next to him had to duck to avoid splashing it on his clothes. Some looked at each other, trying to understand if this was a joke. Others were already starting to move away, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. The woman, however, didn't back down. On the contrary, she marched over to the stairs leading up to the cockpit and pointed an accusing finger in my direction. "Have you gone mad?" she hissed, her voice brimming with hatred. I stood up, grabbed my radio, and said just 2 words, Caleb, it's time. I barely finished speaking and the Coast Guard sirens cut through the night air. It was as if a bomb had exploded in the middle of the deck. Chaos ensued immediately. The guests, who 5 minutes ago thought they were the elite of society, were now running around like frightened cockroaches. Some were trying to justify themselves to the arriving officers. Others were already trying to jump onto the smaller boats anchored next to the yacht. And the woman? Oh, she was as white as paper. For the first time in her life, she seemed speechless. The charity party was over, and her empire was about to collapse. The confusion that spread across the deck was better than anything I could have planned. In less than a minute, that pompous party, full of people who thought they were superior, turned into a scene of pure panic. Desperate guests, trying to pretend they had nothing to do with it, were tripping over each other as they ran to get off the yacht. Some of the women were screaming, as if they had just witnessed a brutal crime, while the men were trying to keep their composure, but their wide eyes and dripping sweat showed their dread. I watched from the top of the booth, holding the microphone for the sound system. The sight of the condominium elite completely losing their dignity as the Coast Guard approached was a gift from the gods. But nothing, absolutely nothing, was more satisfying than the look of defeat on that woman's face. She remained on deck, motionless, as if trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The garish blue dress she was wearing, chosen to be the center of attention that night, now only made her look even more pathetic in the midst of the chaos. The sirens grew louder. The Coast Guard boats were already arriving, and Caleb was leading the operation. I watched as he landed on the pier with a small group of uniformed officers holding clipboards and radios, ready to break up the party for good. The first to be approached was a man who looked like he had been plucked out of an expensive perfume commercial. He raised his hands before any officer had said anything. I didn't know this boat wasn't hers," he stammered. "I only came for the event." "That's too bad," Caleb replied, not showing a shred of patience. "We'll need the data of everyone present for the report." The man swallowed, clearly regretting having stepped in. But as the guests shrank back, trying to appear invisible, the hostess decided she still had a chance of coming out on top. She turned sharply and climbed the stairs to the command cabin, her heels clacking against the wooden floor. "You think you can just show up and ruin everything?" she spat, pointing her finger in my face as if to intimidate me. I crossed my arms, enjoying the spectacle. "Ruin everything? I've only got back what's mine," she snorted. "I'm the president of the Residents Association. I know the rules, and your boat was completely out of line with aesthetic standards. The marina belongs to the community, so we have the right to make decisions for the good of everyone." "Of course," I replied, arching an eyebrow, "because U.S. law clearly states that you can confiscate a private yacht and use it as a party room if you don't like its aesthetics." She turned red. Down below, Caleb was watching everything with his arms crossed and a debauched smile on his face. "You know," I continued, taking a step forward just to see if she would back down, "misappropriation of private property is a crime. Oh, and using stolen property for personal gain? That has a nice name in the judicial system." "This is absurd," she shouted, her voice becoming increasingly hysterical. "Yeah, I thought it was absurd too when I got to the marina and my boat wasn't there," I retorted. "But I guess you only notice the absurdities that bother you, don't you?" She opened her mouth, but before she could come up with any more ridiculous excuses, Caleb came aboard. "Good evening," he greeted, in the slurred voice of someone who had seen this kind of scene many times before. "We received a report about an illegal event taking place on a boat that had been confiscated in an unauthorized manner." "It wasn't confiscated illegally," she retorted, turning to him in despair. "The association has authority over the marina." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Does it?" He then pulled a piece of paper out of his jacket pocket and handed it to her. "Because I just spoke to the Maritime Department, and guess what? The HOA has no jurisdiction over this marina. It was like watching a house of cards collapse. Her eyes went wide, and for a moment, she was completely speechless. "The rightful owner of the boat is right here," Caleb continued, pointing at me. "And according to state and federal law, what happened here today could be considered embezzlement. I could have kept quiet and let Caleb take care of the rest, but where was the fun in that? In short," I said, approaching her, "you stole my boat." The woman's eyes widened even more. "Theft? That wasn't theft." "No? Then what's the word you want to use? Appropriation of community resources? Temporary use of private property without permission?" She looked around, as if expecting one of the guests to defend her. But it was amazing how those people disappeared when the shit hit the fan. Caleb sighed. "Well, whatever you want to call it, we have a problem. And a big one." He signaled to the other officers, who began organizing the guests for interviews. Some were already taking photos of the deck, the decorations, and anything else that could be used as evidence. "If you want, we can do this the easy way," Caleb said, turning to face her. "You answer a few questions, explain how you came up with this brilliant idea, and maybe we'll just record it as a minor incident." The woman looked around once more. Then she took a deep breath and turned to me. "Are you happy now?" she asked in a bitter voice. I smiled. "Quite." She huffed and crossed her arms, looking like a sulky child. But I knew it wouldn't end there. She still thought she could get out of it. She still thought that her ridiculous title within the HOA meant something. She just didn't know that it was only the beginning. I still had a much bigger plan to deal with this woman. And when it was over, she would bitterly regret having pulled up to my yacht. The woman thought everything would be solved with a few well-rehearsed excuses and her false authority as dictator of the condominium. But I already knew the type who thinks they can step on everyone and get away with it, the type who lives in a parallel universe where the rules only apply to others, the type who believes that a leadership position in a neighborhood association is equivalent to a title of nobility. The difference is that, at that moment, she wasn't in the safe territory of meetings where the old suits from the HOA applauded her for banning fences that disharmonized the aesthetics of the neighborhood. She was about to face something she couldn't just sweep under the rug. Still standing there, trying not to show her rising panic, she crossed her arms and raised her chin. "Well, what happens now? Are you going to arrest me?" she said, trying to keep her voice steady, but with a slight tremor that betrayed her. "Oh," she was scared. Caleb gave her a short smile. "Well, that's up to you." She narrowed her eyes, confused. "What do you mean?" "The gentleman here," he pointed at me, "can file a formal complaint and open a case against you for embezzlement, which, depending on the prosecutor's interpretation, could be framed as fraud or even theft. That would mean a long and expensive court case." She swallowed, but kept her pose. "Or," Caleb continued with a casual tone, "we could resolve this in a more educational way." The word educational caught my attention. I turned to Caleb, curious, because I knew he had something planned. And, knowing my friend, it would probably be a lot more fun than simply watching her being handcuffed right there. "And what kind of way would that be?" I asked, already sensing that I was going to like the answer. Caleb gave a half-smile and turned to the woman. "You're going to stand up in front of all the guests, hold this microphone, and admit that you stole this yacht to promote your ridiculous little party." She widened her eyes. "What? What's more," Caleb continued, impassive, "you're also going to explain that the HOA has no authority over the marina, and that all the decisions you made were, in fact, an abuse of power." The silence that followed was delicious. She stood motionless, processing the impending humiliation. Downstairs, the guests watched with the same tension as someone who sees a car crash and can't look away. Some pretended to be busy with their cell phones, but you could tell they were waiting for the grand finale. "This is absurd!" she finally exploded. "You can't make me do this." "Of course we can," Caleb said, shrugging. "But if you prefer, we can go with alternative number 1. You put on your fancy clothes and go to the police station right now. It's your choice." She opened her mouth to retort, but then closed it. Her eyes raced across the deck, assessing her chances. There was no way out. None of the guests would come to her defense. No HOA employee would rush to her rescue. If there was one thing the condo elite knew how to do well, it was to pretend they didn't know someone as soon as the boat started to sink. And her boat was already at the bottom of the ocean. She sighed, her expression contorted with anger and humiliation. "This is an outrage," she muttered. "No, an outrage is what you did to my boat," I corrected, holding out the microphone to her. She hesitated, but knew she had no choice. She took the microphone with trembling hands and slowly turned to face the audience below. The guests were completely silent. She took a deep breath. "Good evening," she began, her voice weak. No smiles now, no posing, just pure despair. "I made a mistake." The word came out choked, as if she was poisoning herself by saying it. "I made the wrong decision to use this yacht for the party without proper authorization. And the HOA has no jurisdiction over the marina, which means that I acted without any legal basis for doing so." There was a moment of dead silence. Then a man in the audience coughed to disguise his laughter. A woman held up a smile with her hand. And then a waiter, a bloody waiter, who was probably just there to serve champagne, let out a muffled laugh. That was enough to bring down her dignity for good. The laughter began to spread like wildfire, some discreet, others brazen. I leaned against the side of the booth, enjoying every second. The queen of the HOA had been dethroned, and now all she had left was public shame. She handed me back the microphone, pressing her lips together as if she wanted to kill me right then and there. "There you go. Satisfied?" "Immensely." The officials began to disperse the crowd, writing down the names of the guests for the report and releasing them one by one. No one wanted to be associated with the fiasco. Some left so quickly that they looked like Olympic athletes. The woman got off the yacht without saying another word. No security guards, no subordinates to accompany her. Just her, alone, sinking into her own humiliation. But I still wasn't completely satisfied, because it was one thing to make her admit her crimes. It was another to ensure that she never again got her dirty hands on anything that didn't belong to her. The next day, I contacted some local journalists. No mainstream media, just reporters who loved hot suburban gossip. I told them everything, provided evidence and even video of the event. The story was published with a headline that could have been written by myself. "President of Residents Association steals yacht for party and is unmasked in public." Her hell began there. The HOA board, which had previously treated her like a goddess, began to publicly disown her. Some members even demanded her immediate dismissal. The scandal caused her to lose any trace of credibility, and her own neighbors started laughing at her in the street. A few weeks later, I received a delightful update. The woman had resigned and put her house up for sale. I had won. My boat was safe, my patience was rewarded, and the condominium was finally free of its little dictator. And to make sure she never forgot her lesson, I left a gift on the boat's dashboard, a forged invitation to another HOA party. If she ever dared to try another one of these, at least she'd have a clear reminder of what happens when you mess with the wrong person. And if you liked this video, don't forget to leave a comment and a like.